Hello, my name is Richard or RJ Eskow, and welcome to the first episode of a new commentary series I'm calling All for All. Once again, I want to thank Democracy at Work for inviting me to do this. And I guess the best way I can describe what we're doing here is by saying it's a kind of weekly discussion about ways to rethink current events. And as I was trying to think of a good way to put that, I thought back to 2011 when the Occupy movement was in full swing. And by the way, we'll get to the Occupy movement before too long and all of this. But at the time, I was in a building on K Street as Occupy protesters were moving by. I don't recall precisely the circumstances, but they had locked down the entire street, I guess, to protect the lobbyists. I was stuck in a lobby with two security guards who I used to chat with once in a while because I had a small office there. And I heard one of them say to the other, "What are they protesting?" And the other one answered, first he said, "Well, they're objecting to the state of," and he waved his hand around in a kind of big circle above his head. It said, "The state of everything." So we're really talking about the state of everything. And I wanted to start this first episode, first of all, by quoting from a poem that I like to quote from. It has a number of lines I really appreciate. It's a poem by Diane DePrima. And one of the lines I often quote says, "The war that matters most is the war against the imagination. All other wars are subsumed in it." I think that's an important commentary on where we of the left are and where we could be. We'll talk about that again in a second, but first, a couple more lines from the poem. Diane DePrima writes, "The only war that matters is the war against the imagination. All other wars are subsumed in it." And you want to think, now, wait a minute, Gaza, World War II, subsumed in it? But yes, in a way, it's true. If we can imagine better, we can avoid the need or the impulse toward war. She says, all wars are subsumed in it, and no one can fight it but you, and no one can fight it for you. It's an individual act of conscience, which speaks to me particularly because I spent a lot of years giving up on my youthful leftism, working in the corporate world as a corporate executive, as a data analysis person, as a policy advisor, computer systems, all of that. I thought those days were over, but I suddenly found myself at the knife edge of an internal conflict, a war within. My conscience just wouldn't let me do what I was doing, particularly because it involved health insurance. So the war against the imagination, I was forced by a kind of personal crisis to imagine something better for myself, or more meaningful at least. And here we are. But the line from the poem I really want to focus on today is a line that says, "History is a living weapon in your hand." She goes on to say, "History is the dream of what it can be." So what does that mean to say history is a living weapon in your hand? It means that the way we see the world to a large extent is defined by the way history and the world has been presented to us since childhood, which is one of the reasons why I'm using this as a starting theme for this program. Take one simple example: Palestine and Israel. I grew up in a time when across the political spectrum, people supported the notion of a Jewish state because, first of all, we weren't told the history of Palestine and the history of peaceful coexistence that had existed there. We weren't told the history of who the oppressors of the Jewish people had been and the fact that the Palestinians had no role in that. We were told that Israel was a land without a people for a people without a land, which was a falsehood, but that's what we were told. We were even, when I was small, I remember my parents I couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, my parents taking me to a movie theater to a movie about Israel where the theme song began, "This land is mine. God gave this land to me." So, because we didn't have the power of history on our side, we didn't understand the future we, the United States, were creating in the Middle East and the anguish and seemingly endless war that would arise from all of that. But that's just one small example. Look at the world. It's more critical, and by all means, I spend every day struggling to figure out what I can do about Gaza. So please, I don't mean to diminish it, but opening the scope a little wider. If you look at everything we deal with in our world today, whether it's private enterprise, cities you can't afford to live in because of sky high rents, permanent financial insecurity and precarity, corporate rule over our daily lives, billionaire oligarchs recreating and controlling our politics. The world didn't have to be this way. Again, this is where history is a living weapon in our hands. There was a time when people shared land and property in places, even like England. We can talk about what Native Americans did. We can talk about the practices and customs in other parts of the world, and we will. But even in England, which is basically the model for the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant racialist and classist foundation of this country. Even England had a period of communality, as some of you know, where people in villages grew produce, working towards a common purpose. They shared the land, they shared many of its resources. Things were perfect, of course. There was poverty, there was brutality. The lords, so-called, what a ridiculous word, by the way, the lords. The lords tormented the peasants, but the land was everybody's to use until they took it. That was the enclosure movement. It happened in the 1600s and the 1800s, and periods in between. But we also had, as we'll get to later in this series, we had a civil war and rebellions against this seizing of the land. But it's important to think back to the fact that this was never inevitable. This world we live in didn't have to be, it became. This taking of wealth has taken different forms of history throughout, I'm sorry, it's taken different forms throughout history, but it has two primary forms that we'll be talking about. First is slavery, of course, and the second is this seizure of public lands by the wealthy, what they called the enclosure movement. Now, even though we believe we've abolished slavery, we still have 2.2 million people in prison in this country. And even though we think the enclosure movement is a thing of the past, the entire construct of private property and how we think of it today grows out of, among other things, the enclosure movement, and especially out of the philosophic rationalizations that were created to justify both of these inhumane practices. We still live under the systems of oligarchical rule that they supported and strengthened and persuaded many people to believe in, and we're still struggling with the inequality, poverty, and war that they've left behind. Now, there's an economic historian named Joan Thirsk who has a good description for what happened after the enclosure movement. She says, and I quote, "Every household became an island unto itself," end quote. She adds, quote, "This was the great revolution in men's lives, greater than all the economic changes that followed enclosure. Yet few people living in this world," meaning our world, "bequeathed to us, the world that was left to us by this process, are capable of gauging the full significance of a way of life that is now lost," end quote. By that, the way of life that is now lost, she means that communal way of life. And she's very right. Few people among us can gauge the full significance of that way of life. So that is going to be one of the goals of the program. Ambitious, I know, but we'll do our best to kind of widen the lens so that we can take in not just the world as it's been crafted for us, but the world as it could be. Now, of course, central to that is the idea that capitalism as we understand it, was inevitable, is a force of nature, and will always exist for us. In Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher popularized the expression that came to be known as TINA, TINA, for there is no alternative. In the United States, especially on the liberal side of the spectrum, the phrase that I think, or the word that I think, has been used to crush our imaginations the most. Obviously, conservatism has its own ways in the right wing of crushing human imaginations. But I think for most of us in this conversation we're having right now, the biggest threat can be to our imaginations can be encapsulated in the word incrementalism. For 50 years now or so, we've been told on the liberal side of the spectrum to embrace a kind of neoliberal economics and a neoconservative military policy, but both are based, especially the economic side of it, on incrementalism. Now, incrementalism is the idea that big changes are a bad idea. You need to just adjust the system a little bit at a time, and things will get better. I actually engaged in a debate with a leading Democratic economist. And by the way, when I say leading economist, I mean reach the highest levels of power in Democratic economic circles. We were engaged in what you might call a friendly difference of opinion about single-payer health care. He was technically wrong, and I caught him on it, but that's just my pride talking. But he said one thing when I was talking about Medicare for all and the need to provide health care for everyone, which is something I know about because of my background in health policy and health economics. He said, well, I'm just going to come right out and say it. I'm an incrementalist. Now, what does it mean to describe yourself, or anyone else for that matter, as an incrementalist? Well, in today's political climate, the idea of incrementalism has evolved from one possible tactic for change, we'll do it gradually, into an identity. He was identifying as an incrementalist. It's also become an ideology. I guess you could call it a matter of political culture. By the time the post-war era came, the American political system was losing any room for dramatic change. We had dramatic change in this country a couple points during history, especially from an economic point of view. Of course, during the FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt years, although I would argue and will argue that activism on the left had as much or more to do with the New Deal changes than Roosevelt himself did. Nevertheless, there was a time when politics had a space for large ideas, the last of which were arguably Medicare and the Civil Rights Act and anti-poverty programs of the 1960s. But gradually, as the decades moved on from there, the 1970s and 80s, Democrats adapted to Reaganism by adopting this philosophy of, well, the system is fine as it is, even as it was not satisfactory to begin with, but even as Reagan was degrading it in various ways, they said, well, we'll make change incrementally. Now, the party's best known accomplishments, Social Security, the Works Project Administration, unemployment insurance, Civil Rights Act, all of the above, Medicare, anti-poverty, none of them were incremental. But somehow we got to the point where a leading policymaker for the Democratic Party could proudly say, I'm an incrementalist. That was a way of saying, don't rock the boat. Now, here's where it gets, for me, critically important to emphasize something. Democrats and liberals are incrementalists. They are still incrementalists. It's why they shut down, among many other reasons, why they shut down Bernie Sanders. And I'll talk a lot in the coming weeks about the culture of liberalism, the left and the Democratic Party. But Joe Biden would have called himself an incrementalist. Obama called himself that. The Clintons, of course. When it came to health reform, the best we could ask for was the Affordable Care Act. So the Democrats want to take small steps. Liberals want to take small steps. Here's one of the many problems with it. First of all, the world is collapsing, and we are not going to rebuild it in a humane form by taking small steps. That's just not going to happen, number one. Number two, the oligarchs and powerful interests that control this country more openly than ever under Trump, but they controlled it before too. The Elon Musks, the Peter Thiels, the tech billionaires, the fossil fuel billionaires, and so on. They don't have small ideas. They're not incrementalists. They're thinking on a scale so large that I don't think most liberal Democrats can even imagine it. So it's another reason to have bold ideas. For example, take the Koch brothers in 1971. I did some library research, archival research on the Koch brothers. In 1971, at university, one of the Kochs, I can't recall, they're interchangeable to me. One of the Koch brothers was already writing about ideas that seemed insane at the time of abolishing Social Security, privatizing this and that. Everybody else thought it was insane too. He had to like print these little mimeograph pamphlets or whatever. A lot of those ideas are now part of the core politics of the ruling party of this country. So that was thinking big. And the tech oligarchs, Musk and his ilk, are even more frightening than that. I have some friends who are in very high, shall we say, billionaire circles in the Silicon Valley, and you'd be astonished at what I'm told they say in private. Now, we have some signs of it in public. We have some signs of it with Musk, but one of their favorite economists is Tyler Cowen. Now, Tyler, that's Cowen. Now, Tyler Cowen believes in the title of one of his books that average is over. Now, what he means by that is that if you're just an average person, which itself is a elitist term because of average by whose standards, right? But if you're just an average person, so-called, you're going to be miserable in the world of the future now. Now, Cohen does this, well, it's not what I want. It's just, I'm just telling it like it is, which is what people always tell you when it is what they want. I can't speak to his motives, but certainly the people who back him and promote him and so on, it is what they want now. So he talks about 85% of the population is going to be redundant. 15%, that is the people who can work with computers, communicate with technology. 15%, or let's say 14.75%, are going to do okay because they'll be above average because average is over, remember? And the last 0.25 will be the billionaires controlling everything. And the remaining 15% will be their workforce. Everybody else will need to be kept calm and quiet and unthreatening. So what that means, among other things, is why have some of the tech billionaires supported a universal basic income? I'm not against a universal basic income on its own merits, but they want to do it specifically so that they can destroy the social welfare state or what remains of it, rip up the social contract or what remains of it, give people a tiny amount that they can live on and say, okay, we've met our obligations to you, and then get them addicted to social media and mine their behavior for chatbots and so-called large language model artificial intelligence, although artificial intelligence is a misnomer. And we'll talk about that too. So this 80-15 scenario is a terrifying one. It's also, by the way, why I suspect there isn't more concern among these groups for addictive drugs becoming a presence in this society. Hey, if the 85% or 80%, whatever you want to call them, if they stay doped up and clicking on social media, at least they won't be bothering us. And I also interviewed an author named Doug Rushkoff, who wrote a book about the fact that he talks a lot about dystopic possibilities from technology, how he was invited by a small group of tech billionaires to go to some secret location because they wanted to pick his brain for how they could protect themselves from the outraged population once civilization collapsed altogether, which it could. I wouldn't put that as the leading possibility, an utter and total civilizational collapse, but it's one of the possible outcomes. And I suspect there'll be a lot of crises facing us, just as we're facing crises today. That is one of the reasons why I think it's important for, as I've said before, our social imaginations to keep pace with our technological imaginations. We have developed all this technology, and by we, I mean we, you and I, the public, has funded this technology, the internet, silicon chips, the inner components of the iPhone. They're all publicly developed and backed, and then of course privatized and used to hypnotize us and distract us. But we need to be able to imagine even more broadly and even more creatively about building a humane society than those people imagine building an exploitative society for the few. Now, I read a book a few years ago called something like A Paradise Made in Hell. And the premise of it was that it was a study of 5 places where there had been terrible disasters. I remember Bhopal in India was one of them. And nobody likes disasters, right? But they're horrible. But one of the observations the author made that I thought was smart was that people find purpose helping one another in a disaster. And I think we've all found that in our lives. And I think that's one of the many signposts we can dig up and unearth to help us become more imaginative in our social thinking, because it doesn't have to be a disaster that brings out this and that. But I've experienced something of that myself. I was a president of a small-ish company when 9/11 happened, and a lot of my staff had family members in the Twin Towers. Fortunately, virtually all of their families survived, but we came together and struggled through the day as best we could. I closed the office, but I said, if anyone wants to stay for the sense of community and belonging, they can. And a lot of people did. It was an awful, awful day. And friends of mine died that day. But we did have a sense of community there. Now, wouldn't it be great if we can develop that sense of solidarity without the horror and death that seems to be nowadays the only thing that can trigger it? And I think we can. I think we can do that. First of all, we have our slow motion disasters underway right now. But secondly, people can also be brought together by visions. So we'll be talking a lot on this program about the visions of the past throughout history. The English Civil War had incredible ideas for communal living, for innovative spirituality, for modes of ecstatic being, to use a phrase I learned from, of all people, Hillary Clinton, which is ironic. Imagination, art, literature, William Blake, the poet, and so many others. So we have that period of history. We have the early Christian church of the first couple hundred years of the contemporary era, which lived communally. We have the French Revolution. We have the European revolutions of 1848. We have the utopian American movements of the 19th century. We have the first 5 years of the Soviet Union where there was wild experimentation. We have the early 1920s and then the 1920s and 30s, which we'll talk to a lot because we had the Townsend clubs, as they were called, named after Dr. Townsend, who existed to push for something like Social Security when that was considered a crazy idea. And we had Eugene V. Debs running for president in the 1920s, and in fact, earlier than that, from prison, promoting ideas that became standard policy a decade or two later. We have some artifacts I uncovered from the Young Communist League in the 1930s in California that I think you'll find interesting. We have the movements of the 1960s where a lot of craziness went on, but there was some serious thought about reinventing the world. We had 1999, which was the year of the World Trade Organization protests. Of course, we had Occupy in 2011, which almost worked. And by almost worked, I mean it would have worked if of all the forces of the current media, industrial, military state hadn't been arrayed against it, if the Obama administration and other federal officials hadn't been coordinating the response to it, if media outlets were not being fed and feeding to their audience lies about it. I had an experience on Fox News about that was kind of funny, actually. People forget, though, that when Occupy first started, it was enormously popular across the political spectrum. The teachers' strikes of 2017, so-called red state teachers' strikes in Oklahoma and in Arizona and so on, these were also extraordinarily popular among people that are thought of as conservative voters because people want to take back control of their lives. And of course, we have Black Lives Matter and other outpourings of popular support as well. Black Lives Matter, too, changed society dramatically, so dramatically that it's become a major initiative of the Trump administration to undo what it did. So we'll think about all of that with a focus not exclusively on economics, certainly on economics and certainly on culture and all its forms, whether it's country music, reggae, movies, detective novels, all sorts of different ways we express ourselves, but also political tracts and movements that we might not think of as left-wing, but could become left-wing. The truckers' protests at the Canadian border, or West Virginia, the blocking of private roads, or the blocking of public roads so they couldn't be made private, excuse me, on that. And so we'll be discussing all of these with the idea that it will be enjoyable together for all of us to explore these ideas. I have a million things I want to talk to you about. You may have some things I haven't thought of, in which case feel free to drop them in the credits or get back to us on that. But I'll leave you with something I said in the introduction to this program that I still believe. There was that old saying that the church people used to say that the devil's greatest trick is convincing you he doesn't exist. I still say that capitalism's greatest trick is convincing us that we don't exist as a we, as a communality, as a community, locally, nationally, and globally. And so the we is the important pronoun here. And that's what we'll be focusing on in the weeks and months to come. Thanks so much for listening, and hopefully I'll see you again next week. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this has been All for All on the Democracy at Work channel.